The forward staging post outside Puok Tui province hummed with the nervous energy of an impending joint patrol. The air was thick, smelling of diesel, damp earth, and instant coffee. Lieutenant Clark stood among his American recon team, a picture of textbook military perfection. They were young, sharp, and geared head to toe in regulation issue kit. Clark believed deeply in the systems, the fire teams, and the doctrine that had trained them. To him, the jungle was merely a variable that could be systematically controlled and ultimately beaten with superior equipment. Clark surveyed his men with immense pride, running through a mental 10-point checklist. Their jungle boots were laced tight to the mid-calf, securing their ankles exactly as the instructors at Fort Benning had drilled into them. They wore starched camouflage, lightweight webbed gear holding spare magazines, first aid pouches, and water purification tablets. Each man carried a pristine rifle with the sling adjusted to the regulation length. This meticulous preparation was not arrogance. It was an absolute faith in the American military-industrial complex. Then, his gaze shifted to the Australian SAS team waiting near the tree line. There were 5 of them, looking dirty, terrifyingly calm, and utterly non-standard. What immediately caught the eye was their footwear. Their boots looked as though they had been butchered with a hunting knife. The upper leather had been completely sliced away from the ankles down. There were no laces, just rough strips of canvas tape and thick rubber bands holding the remaining canvas and rubber soles loosely to their hardened feet. To the Americans, this display looked like undeniable sloppiness, an improvisation born from a pathetic poverty of supply. Real soldiers, the kind backed by immense doctrine and endless funding, simply did not mutilate their primary mode of transportation. A loud American sergeant with mirrored sunglasses pointed a thick finger and cracked a joke, asking loudly if Charlie had stolen their supply truck in the middle of the night. The nervous laughter of the American soldiers rolled across the sandbags, validating their own sense of procedural superiority. The SAS team did not respond to the provocation. One of them, a wiry scout possessing a face that looked carved from weathered stone, simply bent down, adjusted the canvas tape around his exposed foot, and kept walking toward the deep green tree line. They carried the quiet, heavy certainty of men who had already paid a terrible price for wearing equipment the wrong way. They had no interest in explaining the brutal arithmetic of the jungle to a group of men who still believed in instruction manuals. Watching them move, Clark leaned toward his radio operator and whispered confidently that the Australians were going to lose their feet to the environment by nightfall. The operator grinned back, muttering that he bet those ragged guys had already lost all their military standards. The American team felt secure in their mockery, fortified by the comforting weight of their laminated maps and backup radio batteries. They simply did not know that the jungle operated on a ruthless logic entirely separate from any printed military regulation. As the joint patrol finally stepped off the secure perimeter, the weather was holding nicely. The jungle canopy was muggy but relatively dry, and the footing on the red earth remained solid. The American boots were doing exactly what they were designed to do, providing excellent ankle support and traction. Clark took the lead position with a surge of confidence, thinking to himself that if these Allied soldiers wanted to hike barefoot through this green hell, he would let them learn their lesson the hard way. The Australians did not march like men on a parade ground attempting to conquer the earth with heavy footfalls. They moved with a silent, casual grace, stepping lightly and avoiding the thickest mud patches instinctively. Their gear was stripped down to the absolute bare minimum, featuring taped magazines to prevent noise and rusted weapons modified with wooden blocks. They flowed through the dense vegetation rather than pushing against it, demonstrating a symbiotic relationship with the harsh environment that the heavily burdened Americans completely failed to recognize. During a brief halt for water, the stark contrast in their operational philosophies became painfully clear. The Americans unhooked standard canteens, carefully adding purification tablets according to the prescribed timeline. The Australians simply drank, their eyes constantly scanning the shifting shadows of the canopy above. Clark looked down at his perfectly structured leather boots, admiring the drainage holes that the manual promised would keep his feet dry. He felt a deep sense of security, completely unaware that those tiny holes would soon become his greatest nightmare. The afternoon wore on, and the oppressive humidity began to thicken the air until it felt like breathing warm soup. The American soldiers maintained their disciplined formation, but the heavy web gear and tightly laced boots were already generating immense body heat. Sweat poured down their faces, soaking their wool-blend socks inside the impenetrable leather casings. Meanwhile, the Australians remained surprisingly cool, the air circulating freely around their exposed ankles and lower feet, their modified gear allowing their bodies to properly vent the exhausting tropical heat. A subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure went entirely unnoticed by the American recon unit, who were too focused on monitoring their compass bearings and radio frequencies. The Australian scout, however, paused for a fraction of a second, his head tilting slightly as he analyzed the sudden stillness of the surrounding insect life. He did not issue a warning or reach for a poncho. He merely adjusted the grip on his heavily taped rifle and slightly lengthened his stride, knowing exactly what the sky was preparing to deliver. The canopy high above them began to darken rapidly, shifting from a vibrant green to a bruised, ominous gray. The true enemy in this theater of war was not waiting in a concealed trench with an assault rifle. It was currently gathering immense power in the clouds directly overhead. The profound difference between textbook military standards and hard-earned survival intelligence was about to be brutally measured. In this unforgiving jungle, the ultimate currency was not firepower, but rather inches of rotting flesh and liters of blood. The rain did not arrive with the dramatic thunderclaps or sudden violence that Hollywood movies often portray. There was no warning whatsoever, just a slow, heavy drip that began to penetrate the dense canopy. At first, fat drops merely punched through the leaves, darkening the red earth beneath their heavy marching boots. Then came another drop, and another, until the entire jungle simply exhaled water. Within a matter of minutes, the environment transformed from a dry, albeit muggy, tactical theater into a saturated, unforgiving sponge that swallowed everything. For the Australian SAS team, absolutely nothing changed in their operational rhythm. They did not stop to retrieve ponchos, they did not adjust their steady pace, and they did not even look up at the darkening sky. The tropical water ran down their hardened legs, flowed straight through the massive gaps in their cut-down boots, and returned immediately to the soil where it belonged. Their feet remained light and unburdened, moving freely through the accumulating mud without the massive suction effect that trapped standard footwear. The American team, however, noticed the environmental shift almost immediately, and the impact was purely mechanical. At first, it was simply an annoying discomfort, characterized by a distinct squelching sound every single time a regulation boot struck the muddy ground. Then, the true weight of the water manifested, each tightly laced leather boot rapidly filled with muddy rainwater, holding the liquid securely inside and stubbornly refusing to let it go. The standard-issue wool-blend socks absorbed it all like giant, suffocating sponges wrapped tightly around their skin. With every passing minute, each forward step became significantly heavier than the last, completely shattering the Americans' marching rhythm. One of the younger soldiers muttered under his breath, asking the lieutenant to hold up as he knelt in the mud to physically dump a liter of water from his boot. The patrol paused, losing their tactical momentum as the rain steadily intensified. Thick, sticky mud formed rapidly on the trail, turning previously secure routes into slippery traps and transforming gentle slopes into dangerous, uncontrollable slides for the heavy boots. Lieutenant Clark tried desperately to ignore the growing, throbbing ache radiating from his own waterlogged feet. He mentally repeated the reassurances from his training, telling himself that this discomfort was temporary and that his boots were explicitly engineered for this terrain. The field manual had clearly stated that the integrated drainage holes would act as ventilation outlets to expel moisture. However, the manual had not accounted for the thick, adhesive clay of Puok Tui, which immediately clogged those tiny holes, sealing the water permanently inside the leather casing. By the second unbroken hour of torrential tropical rain, the skin on Clark's heels already felt dangerously raw and tender. Every single step caused the heavy, wet leather to rub violently against his skin, and every step burned with a rising friction that could not be ignored. Another American soldier abruptly stopped his forward movement, breathing hard through his teeth. "Sir, My feet are going entirely numb, he whispered fiercely, leaning heavily against a massive tree trunk as the water continued to cascade down his rigid combat helmet. Clark briefly looked back at the Australian scouts, who were now casually maintaining a 30-meter lead ahead of his struggling team. The SAS men were already scanning the dense tree line with surgical precision, acting as if the catastrophic shift in weather had absolutely zero impact on their mission. Their gait remained fluid and uninterrupted, completely devoid of the heavy, dragging steps that now plagued the American unit. Clark felt the very first undeniable flicker of internal doubt regarding his sacred military doctrine and advanced equipment. This nascent doubt was not a loud, panicked realization, but rather a sharp, quiet acknowledgement of their tactical vulnerability. The environment was systematically degrading their combat effectiveness far faster than any enemy contact could have achieved. The heavy web gear now sagged under the weight of absorbed rain, pulling painfully at their tired shoulders. But it was the boots, those symbols of structural pride and military standardization, that were inflicting the most severe damage, turning each man into a slow, easily trackable target in the dense foliage. During a forced halt, Clark could not contain his frustration any longer. He looked at the broad-chested Australian corporal and asked bluntly what exactly happened to their boots. The corporal looked down at his exposed, muddy feet, and then stared back at Clark as if the officer had asked a remarkably stupid question. "Cut them," he replied plainly, without a single hint of sarcasm. Clark blinked rapidly, asking if they did it on purpose, completely baffled by the deliberate destruction of standard-issue government military equipment. The Australian soldier smirked slightly, a grim expression forged by years of agonizing long-range patrols. "Mate, in 2 hours, that thing is not a boot anymore. It is a bloody bucket," he explained in a thick, uncompromising Queensland accent. "I would rather cut it to pieces myself than let it rot my feet right off my legs." There was absolutely no false bravado in his statement, nor was there any desire to convert the American officer. It was just the quiet certainty of a man who knew the brutal truth. Clark shook his head in stubborn disbelief, clinging desperately to the rules he had been taught. To his deeply ingrained military mindset, intact boots represented essential protection and vital physical structure for a combat soldier. His drill instructors back in the United States had aggressively drilled it into his head. Secure your feet properly, and they will invariably carry you through the worst of the fight. To deliberately slice away that protective leather seemed like an act of pure madness, an open invitation to severe injury and immediate infection. But the jungle did not care about American training doctrine, structural integrity, or the pride of a commissioned officer. It only cared about the relentless accumulation of water, the dragging weight of soaked canvas, and the inevitable friction that caused deep wounds. As late afternoon shadows stretched across the flooded trail, the oppressive squelching sound dominated the patrol, masking any noise the enemy might make. This wasn't a sudden, violent ambush with rifle fire. This was simply the weather, and it was undeniably, systematically winning the war. By the next morning, the mocking jokes and confident banter had completely vanished from the American ranks. They moved through the dense undergrowth in absolute silence now. But it was not the disciplined stealth of a highly trained reconnaissance unit. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of men whose energy had been entirely consumed by physical pain. The American team was visibly limping, awkwardly shifting their weight from foot to foot in a desperate attempt to mask the severe structural damage occurring inside their waterlogged leather boots. The jungle possessed an uncanny ability to smell physical weakness, drawn to it like a predator sensing fresh blood in the water. The devastating blisters had formed rapidly overnight in the suffocating dampness. It began as localized hot spots of irritation, escalating quickly into tearing friction, and finally pooling with fluid. Now, the weakened skin simply peeled open in raw, agonizing patches where the rigid boot leather and the relentlessly wet wool socks had violently ground against their softened flesh for over 15 uninterrupted hours of marching. One of the younger men, a tall private named Louis with a background in specialized mountain warfare, finally reached his breaking point. He collapsed heavily onto a rotting log, his face pale and drawn tight with exhaustion. With trembling hands, he unstrapped his heavy regulation boot and slowly began to peel back the soaked, muddy sock. The degraded skin of his foot simply came away with the wool fabric, leaving a horrific, raw wound exposed to the humid, bacteria-laden air of the Vietnamese combat zone. Lieutenant Clark winced visibly at the brutal sight while the other American soldiers quickly looked away in quiet horror. Thick pus, fresh blood, and violently shredded tissue lined the entire sole of the young private's foot. His toes were swollen to twice their normal size and colored a deep, angry purple, while the critical heel structure had completely ruptured under the strain. The unforgiving jungle had systematically chewed through the soldier's flesh, not with the sharp teeth of a tiger, but with persistent moisture and relentless friction. Clark dropped heavily to one knee into the mud, desperately calling for the standard-issue medical kit. They hurriedly attempted to wrap the ruined foot in sterile white gauze, hoping to provide some measure of stabilization and relief. However, the heavy tropical rain and the residual water pouring from Louis's legs soaked straight through the protective bandages in under a single minute. The entire patrol stalled completely, the American squad visibly struggling to maintain their composure as their meticulously planned operational timeline evaporated into the humid air. The advanced gear that had once looked so perfectly squared away and professional now sagged pathetically under the immense weight of the water. Their polished boots, once a proud symbol of military structure and unyielding discipline, now squelched sickeningly with every single step, resembling soaked loaves of heavy bread. Meanwhile, the Australian SAS scouts had not stopped moving for a moment. They had smoothly broken off ahead of the stalled Americans, looping through the treacherous terrain like silent, unburdened phantoms perfectly adapted to the harsh tactical environment. Eventually, one of the phantoms silently circled back to check on the delayed American element. It was the exact same broad-chested corporal from the previous afternoon, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stoicism. He crouched down near the wounded private, his dark eyes scanning the catastrophic damage to the boy's raw, bleeding foot. He did not offer any useless words of sympathy, nor did he make any condescending remarks about American training methods. He simply nodded his head once, recognizing a familiar, agonizing battlefield reality. The Australian veteran calmly stood up, reached into a battered canvas belt pouch, and retrieved a surprisingly primitive instrument. He pulled out a small, broken piece of a standard hacksaw blade. It was heavily blackened with carbon soot to prevent any reflective glare, and its jagged metal teeth were visibly worn dull from years of extensive field use. It was a crude, ugly piece of metal, completely devoid of any official military serial numbers, yet it represented the ultimate culmination of brutal, hard-earned jungle survival experience. He held the rusted piece of metal out toward the American officer with a perfectly steady hand. If you genuinely want to keep your men on their feet, you might want to severely ruin those boots right now, the corporal stated flatly. There was absolutely no lecturing tone in his voice, no arrogant attempt to say, "I told you so" to the struggling Americans. It was simply a pragmatic offer, from one experienced combat soldier to another, designed purely to keep the Joint Patrol moving forward alive. Lieutenant Clark stared at the jagged piece of metal, but he did not reach out to take it just yet. His ingrained military pride, fortified by years of strict academy training and rigid operational doctrine, still held a dangerous amount of psychological weight in his mind. The Australian corporal did not wait around for the American officer to undergo a philosophical crisis. He simply placed the dirty blade on a nearby stump, turned his back, and melted seamlessly away into the dense green foliage without another sound. Left alone with his suffering men, Clark looked down at the crude saw blade resting on the wet wood. He then looked at his own regulation boots, which were already filling to the brim with muddy rainwater once again, despite his desperate attempts to drain them. The relentless tropical rain had not stopped pouring for a single second, and the narrow jungle trail ahead was only going to become significantly steeper and much more treacherous. The inescapable reality of their tactical situation was finally crushing his immense stubbornness. The American officer found himself trapped in a brutal psychological crossfire between the rigid regulations he had sworn to uphold and the agonizing medical reality destroying his unit. To deliberately destroy government property was a severe violation, but to lose a man to infection in hostile territory was a catastrophic failure of combat leadership. He slowly reached out his trembling hand toward the rusted metal teeth of the hacksaw blade. The true test of his command was no longer about fighting the enemy. It was about amputating his own pride. The relentless downpour continued to drown the jungle, turning the narrow, winding trail into an impassable river of thick, slick mud. Lieutenant Clark remained kneeling beside Private Louis, holding the blood-soaked gauze that offered absolutely no protection against the catastrophic environment. The young soldier was whimpering quietly, his face entirely drained of color as the agonizing pain radiating from his destroyed heel threatened to send him into severe physical shock. The once proud American reconnaissance team was completely paralyzed, trapped not by enemy gunfire, but by the devastating failure of their heavily structured, standard-issue military equipment. Before the deeply conflicted American officer could issue a single cohesive order, the same broad-chested Australian corporal suddenly materialized directly beside them. He moved without making a single sound, appearing from the dense foliage with a calm demeanor that bordered on absolute boredom. The seasoned veteran took one long, analytical look at the trembling private, observing the fresh blood continuously soaking through the tight, wet laces of the intact regulation boot. Without asking for any permission from the commanding officer, the SAS soldier knelt down in the mud and reached for the rusted hacksaw blade resting nearby. The Australian corporal firmly grabbed the private's ruined foot, ignoring the sudden wince of sheer agony from the young American soldier. With a steady, practiced motion, he pressed the blackened, jagged teeth of the hacksaw blade directly against the thick upper leather of the jungle boot. He began to saw aggressively, the harsh, scraping sound of tearing leather cutting through the rhythmic drumming of the heavy tropical rain. He systematically destroyed the structural integrity of the footwear, completely ignoring the deeply ingrained military regulations regarding the deliberate destruction of expensive government-issued combat property. When the brutal field surgery was finally completed, the heavy top half of the regulation boot hung loosely from the sole like a violently peeled piece of dead skin. The profound relief was almost immediate, as the horribly swollen, damaged foot could finally breathe in the humid air, allowing the trapped, filthy water to run off harmlessly into the mud. The Australian corporal did not offer a single word of lecture, nor did he smile or show any sign of condescending judgment toward the struggling squad. He simply nodded his head once and silently vanished back into the trees. Lieutenant Clark watched the silent phantom disappear into the impenetrable green shadows, slowly turning his gaze back to the bloodied piece of metal left behind. He carefully picked up the dull, rusted saw blade, feeling the rough texture of the carbon soot rubbing against his wet fingertips. The immense weight of his formal military education and his fierce pride fought a brief, desperate battle against the undeniable, agonizing reality unfolding right in front of him. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, the young American officer finally crouched down in the heavy mud and brought the blade to his own foot. He began violently hacking away at the familiar, structured leather of his own meticulously maintained combat boots, the very same boots he had proudly worn for over a year. He systematically destroyed the heavy material that he had previously believed strictly defined what a professional, capable soldier was supposed to look like in the field. The thick leather tore apart significantly easier than he had initially expected, surrendering quickly to the jagged teeth of the crude tool. As the heavy material fell away, dropping into the muddy water, his stubborn American pride was violently amputated right alongside it. Witnessing their commanding officer deliberately mutilate his standard-issue gear, the remaining American soldiers quickly followed suit without needing a single verbal command. A strange, metallic chorus of tearing leather and scraping metal briefly replaced the miserable, squelching sounds that had previously defined their agonizing march. They ruthlessly sliced away the suffocating upper structures, aggressively removing the restrictive laces and tightly bound canvas that had trapped the acidic rainwater against their flesh. In a matter of minutes, the entire reconnaissance unit had effectively transitioned from a heavily regulated force into a ragged, desperate band of practical survivors. When the heavily battered American patrol finally resumed their difficult trek through the flooded jungle, they walked the remainder of the steep trail in absolute silence. This quietness was no longer rooted in agonizing defeat or total physical exhaustion, but rather in a profound, necessary adjustment to their hostile tactical environment. Step by agonizing step, The heavily burdened soldiers slowly learned how to flow seamlessly with the dense terrain instead of constantly fighting aggressively against it. Their painfully raw feet bled significantly less, and their previously compromised physical balance gradually returned as the heavy, trapped water drained away. They permanently stopped trying to correct the relentless jungle with their rigid military doctrine, choosing instead to simply move continuously within its unforgiving parameters. Their newly cut-down boots naturally flexed with the incredibly uneven terrain, constantly draining the heavy, accumulated tropical rainwater with every single deliberate movement they made. There was absolutely no more sickening sloshing sounds echoing through the trees, and the dangerous, uncontrollable slipping down muddy embankments was vastly reduced. They began to establish a steady, reliable rhythm, mirroring the quiet, efficient forward momentum that the Australian scouts had naturally maintained since the very beginning. Lieutenant Clark cautiously watched an Australian scout effortlessly step directly through a waist-deep pool of stagnant, brown mud, emerging smoothly on the other side. The officer attempted the exact same maneuver, fully expecting his heavily laden leg to get trapped by the intense, suffocating suction of the thick clay. However, without the tightly laced leather upper acting as an anchor, his modified foot simply slipped free from the dangerous mud with surprising ease. He continued moving forward without breaking his stride, realizing with profound clarity that their previous suffering had been entirely self-inflicted by their own gear. Near the vulnerable rear of the patrol line, the injured Private Louis limped forward with a completely new sense of manageable, dull pain rather than sharp agony. He looked down at his violently butchered footwear, watching the filthy water wash harmlessly over his heavily bandaged heel and flow directly back out into the flooded trail. He leaned slightly toward the soldier walking beside him, whispering quietly under his heavy, ragged breath that those quiet Allied scouts had known this brutal reality all along. They had understood the terrible, bloody price of military arrogance from the very first day. Lieutenant Clark clearly heard the private's whispered realization drift softly through the heavy, humid air. But he firmly chose not to offer any verbal reply. He simply did not need to say anything at all, because the undeniable, brutal truth of their current situation was practically written in the bloody mud beneath them. The American commander just kept his head down, maintaining a steady, newly learned pace as the relentless tropical rain continued to violently batter his exhausted shoulders. The strict, unyielding illusion of American regulatory supremacy had been completely washed away, leaving only the raw, necessary mechanics of survival. By the fourth consecutive day of the grueling patrol, the relentless tropical rain still had not stopped, but all internal American resistance had completely vanished. The men no longer complained about the agonizing trench foot, nor did they question the previously strange methods of the heavily battered Australian reconnaissance unit. They had fully adapted to the brutal environment, systematically learning to securely tape their bruised ankles exactly like the silent SAS operators. They diligently learned the miserable art of drying their filthy wool socks with their own fading body heat during the freezing, terrifyingly pitch-black jungle nights. During quiet, tense moments huddled around smokeless tactical fires, some of the young American soldiers had even begun to carve their own ruined boots further. They aggressively hacked away any remaining, useless leather that trapped excess moisture against their raw, healing skin. Absolutely no one within the ranks called this desperate act copying the Allied forces, and no one called it a failure of their vaunted national military doctrine. It simply was the undeniable, harsh reality of their immediate existence, a pragmatic battlefield evolution forced upon them by an environment that actively despised their heavily funded presence. That final morning in the dense brush, the two battered teams approached a rapidly flowing, shallow ravine cutting directly across their extraction route. The American soldiers, who had previously stumbled like heavily burdened pack animals, now moved with a slow, deliberate fluidity, carefully testing every single footfall in the rushing water. The Australian veterans crossed the treacherous gap like silent ghosts, demonstrating a sure-footed, precise momentum that disturbed almost nothing. Lieutenant Clark watched their flawless execution from the muddy bank with a quiet, lingering frown permanently etched onto his exhausted face, processing the immense tactical difference. His expression was no longer one of arrogant frustration, but rather one of profound, humbling realization regarding the true nature of elite jungle warfare. The American officer finally understood what he had completely failed to grasp at the very beginning of this miserable, eye-opening deployment. The violently cut boots, the drastically stripped-down combat gear, and the unnerving, constant silence were not signs of pathetic desperation or a lack of proper military funding. It was pure, lethal design, the ultimate product of extended time, spilled blood, and the jungle's quiet, incredibly unforgiving feedback loop. Later, while pausing briefly beneath a thick, relatively dry patch of massive canopy to wring out their heavy shirts, the unspoken bond solidified. Corporal Bell, a young American who had not spoken a single word since his feet had ruptured, looked over at the resting SAS operators. With half of his foot heavily wrapped in filthy medical gauze and his butchered boots completely unrecognizable, he muttered quietly that they knew all this from day one. No one bothered to answer him, because absolutely no one needed to confirm what had already been paid for in sheer agony. One of the quiet Australians, the exact same wiry scout who had smiled days ago at the ignorant convict comment, casually caught Bell's tired eye. The seasoned veteran did not offer a mocking grin this time, nor did he display any sense of arrogant superiority over the crippled American soldier. He simply nodded his head once, a deeply respectful, silent gesture that clearly translated to saying that now the young man finally understood the real war. Bell slowly nodded back, cementing a profound, mutual respect forged entirely by shared suffering and the brutal destruction of textbook theory. The battered American squad never explicitly asked for any further tactical help, and the hardened Australian veterans never offered any unsolicited survival advice. But in that fleeting, silent moment under the dripping canopy, the two vastly different military teams understood each other perfectly. They were definitely not the same breed of soldier, differing wildly in their official doctrine, their unit culture, and their operational style. Yet, they both intimately knew the taste of agonizing pain, freezing sweat, and exactly what it truly meant to walk with fresh blood filling your ruined boots and still keep pushing forward. As the joint patrol finally moved on toward the designated extraction coordinates, the hungry jungle immediately swallowed their muddy trail without leaving a trace. There were no deep, heavy footprints left behind by standard souls, no loud voices echoing off the trees, just pure, lethal forward motion. The American operators were still noticeably slower and vastly less efficient than their allied counterparts, but now they were actively listening, watching, and constantly adjusting. And the Australians simply kept walking ahead, maintaining their exact same grueling pace and impenetrable silence, completely unbothered by the miserable men trailing closely behind them. When the exhausted men finally breached the defensive perimeter and returned to the fortified firebase, it was just another loud, chaotic day for the war. A massive transport helicopter lifted off heavily in the hazy distance, while a metal canteen loudly clanged against a steel tent pole somewhere nearby. A completely new, fresh-faced group of replacement troops was busy unloading heavy wooden crates of pristine combat equipment, looking completely dry, shiny, and offensively clean. The grueling, transformative patrol was officially over, and Lieutenant Clark's battered team stepped off the muddy trail with a radically changed perspective. The returning men were heavily streaked with foul-smelling mud, covered in weeping blisters, and permanently altered by their harsh exposure to reality. A starched logistics officer walking past the landing zone stopped dead in his tracks, staring down at their violently mutilated footwear in absolute disgust. "What the hell happened to your standard-issue boots?" the officer demanded loudly, completely appalled by the blatant destruction of expensive United States government property. Clark did not bother to respond to the arrogant question, simply staring right through the clean officer with the hollow, exhausted eyes of a veteran. Behind the lieutenant, Private Louis hobbled forward awkwardly, his right boot cut nearly down to the rubber sole and held together entirely by filthy tape. The young soldier did not flinch at the harsh reprimand, nor did he attempt to defend himself with any textbook military regulations or excuses. "We simply made them significantly better, sir," he muttered coldly, limping past the bewildered officer with a heavy, bloody humility that completely silenced the rear echelon soldier. Meanwhile, the SAS team offered absolutely no formal farewells to their American counterparts, completely ignoring standard military protocol and official debriefings. Later that night, sitting alone on his narrow canvas cot with his ruined feet heavily wrapped in fresh white gauze, Clark opened his patrol report. He reached into his battered tactical pack and pulled out the dull, rusted hacksaw blade, placing it deliberately on the wooden table beside his sidearm. Under the official section strictly labeled for equipment improvement recommendations, he wrote a single, defiant sentence advocating for mandatory blade tools for immediate boot modification. He paused, stared at the rusted metal, and added his final, chilling thought. Let the new guys laugh. The rain will teach them.